All right, ladies and gentlemen, today's tutorial will be about Adobe Photoshop's 3D workspace. So the objective is students will be able to manipulate, light, and render a logo in Photoshop's 3D workspace. Now this is just going to be a basic introduction. It's going to be an exploration of some of the tools available to you through Photoshop to create a 3D object. And with that 3D object, there are a lot of things you can do with it. Number one, it's just an extra thing for design purposes. You can also actually export it as an object and import it into other 3D software. You can also print it as a 3D object if you have a 3D printer. So a lot of things you can do with this. Now, the first thing you're going to need to do is choose a logo. Okay, so you have to download the template I've given you, and you have 6 choices. It's totally up to you as far as which logo you choose. I have an idea of which logo the majority of you are going to choose, but it really doesn't matter. You need to download and open this in Photoshop. I've also added guides on here, and these guides are important for you to use to select properly your logo. Also notice I have 2 layers. Layer 2 has the logos in them with a transparent background. I do have a color fill of green. It's just sort of a random color, but that's what we have now. So what I want to make sure you do is go to View and Snap. You have to make sure Snap is on, and Snap to Guides and Document Bounds are checked, because we're going to use our marquee tool. And in this case, I'm going to do the target logo. So I'm going to grab my marquee tool, and I'm going to go up close to the top left of my guides, and I'm going to drag, and you'll see that the marquee will snap to those guides. And that's important because we want a decent space around our logo. Now that we have color fill selected on our layers, we're going to hit Control C to copy, Control N for new document, and yes, we want to keep the clipboard setting and hit Create. Once we have that created, we can paste that green in there. You can actually change that to any color you want. In fact, I'm going to merge that down to the background. So I'm going to hit Control E to merge down. Now we're going to go back to the template and switch layers. We're going to go to layer 2. There we go, and hit Control C again to copy the target logo. Go back to our working document, Control V to paste. And now we have the logo nice and big, and we have the background ready to go. And now we're going to jump right in and make this thing 3-dimensional. So as you all know, we have 2D, right? So 2D is the X direction, which is horizontal. We have Y, the other dimension, which is vertical. And now we're going to add Z, which is depth. So foreground, middle ground, and background. So to convert your logo in layer 1, I'm going to right click on it. For some reason, Photoshop is taking its sweet time today. I'm going to go to New 3D Extrusion from Selected Layer. There are different ways of doing this. That is one way. Now it asks you, would you like to switch to the 3D workspace? And we want to answer yes. Right now, I am currently in the Essentials, which is the default workspace. We want to convert to the 3D workspace, which will add a different window. And now I want to make sure you organize your user interface to make this as easy as possible for you. So the 2 main windows that we're going to use when we play with 3D objects in Photoshop are the new 3D layer, which has a bunch of layers. We'll call these layers in them. And we also want to make sure we can see our properties window very easily. If you can't see that, or if it's embedded somewhere else, make sure you detach it, pull it out, and you have it readily available. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is obviously notice that we have a different sort of grid and things in our UI, in our scene. I like to call things scenes when we have 3D. I like to call them documents or canvas when we're doing 2D. So you can see that this is now converted to 3D. 3 things to note about color, and this is pretty standard across most 3D platforms. Red is usually, and I say usually X, horizontal. Green is usually Y, which is vertical. And blue is usually Z, which is depth. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. But the first thing I really want you to do is go to your 3D window and click on each one. And notice the changes that occur, especially in your properties channel, along with your scene, what's happening. You don't have to know what they're what it's showing you yet. We'll get into that, but I just want you to be comfortable with what's going on. Now we have a scene layer that has a bunch of different properties. We have our camera, which is called current view. We have our light, which has its own little manipulator there in the middle. We have our layer. Now this layer is actually our object. And our object consists of sort of sub-layers or materials below it. And you can see they are nested below layer 1. But this is the overall object. We have boundary constraints. That's a little confusing. I believe those are there because we have sort of a cutout object in the middle of, we have a circle and then we have a ring. And I think that's why those are created there. We also have default camera, and we'll talk more about that down the road. So get comfortable with all these things. You'll see that I click each material and it selects sort of each face. Like this front thing is a face along with this dot. The sides are a different face. The back is a different face. But we can manipulate each one individually. Now, the first thing I want you to do is click on your environment. So we're going to start at the top and work our way down. In our environment layer, we see properties, okay? And we don't really need to pay too much attention to this at this time, but I want you to pay attention to IBL. Now, IBL stands for image-based lighting. So it's, I don't want to get too far into it, but it's basically a default lighting system that, especially if you're going to use a super high specular or reflective material for your work, that this really affects it. We don't need that for this project, so we're just going to uncheck it and get rid of the IBL. And now we have basic flat lighting. The next thing we want to do is we can go to our scene, and there's not really a whole lot we're going to deal with in the scene. You can play with that if you want. Really, we can't make too many mistakes. We can always undo with Control-Z, so I'm not worried about that. But I want you to get comfortable with the camera. Cameras are essential in 3D. This current view camera right now shows us the very front from the positive Z direction looking back into the negative Z direction. But I want you to look up at our options. In 3D mode, it says we have different options for manipulating our camera. And in Photoshop, there are a couple of different ways where we can utilize the camera. One way is up here on the options bar. This is orbit, this is roll, this is pan, this is slide, and this is zoom, okay? The one I like to use, I really don't like to go up and down and all over the place all the time. I don't think it's as efficient to work that way. But we have this little window in here that you can move around and put it close to maybe how you tend to work. And this one only has 3 options. So we have orbit, pan, and dolly. And those 3 are the typical standard camera movements when you're working in 3. And that's another reason why I like to use these. And I guess the last reason is you have this roll option, and if I click on that and I come down into my scene and I left click and I hold and I roll, well, I don't really see much, really any advantage to using roll. It's just going to mess up my orientation of my camera. So I'm going to Control-Z and undo that. But if I go to any of these 3, and if I left click on this logo, in fact, I'm going to go up here and reset this because I don't like that selected. If I go on this logo and I left click and I now move and I'm holding the left mouse button, I can orbit my camera, which is sort of nice. If you ever get disoriented, you can go back to your 3D window and click default camera and it'll take you right back to the beginning. Okay, but this is orbit, very important, so we can actually see the space, see the depth in our work. We also have pan, which is just basically move things around. We can recenter things. And we have dolly. Dolly is sort of another term for zoom. All right, so we can zoom in and out, give us a little more freedom, a little more space to work. But those are the 3 main ones that you need to become comfortable with. So what I want you to do, and in the end what we want is to have this sort of this render of this object. And when I say render, we're going to end up with a 2-dimensional image. But I want you to rotate just to the side, and it doesn't really matter which one you choose, but we want to be able to see the depth of your logo. So I think that will work right there. And now we don't want this material, which is assigned to the extrusion. This is called the extrusion. We don't want that material to be gray, so we want it to be red just like the logo is. So we're going to go and change that right now. In fact, we're going to do it to a few of these materials. So in your 3D window, I want you to choose layer 1 front inflation material. That is actually selecting, again, the initial ring and this dot that's here in the middle. And in the properties window, we now have options for this material to change this material. The only one we want to play with right now really is base color. You can go ahead and play with all these other ones and see what happens. That's up to you, but we really want to make sure we change this base color. So when I click that swatch, I get a color picker, and I'm going to go right onto that logo, and I'm going to click that red color. And you didn't see much happen, but I can tell you it actually filled in some of these weird edges that were happening on our 3D object. The next one we don't need to deal with is front bevel. We need to pay attention to our extrusion material, which again is that depth attribute to our object. So I'm going to go up to base color again. Again, I'm going to use the color picker to select that front red, and I'm going to click OK. And that's really all we need to do right now with our object. I can go back up. Oh, and by the way, you don't have to have the camera selected to manipulate the camera. If I have my object selected, I can still go to these icons and move around, which is sort of nice. And notice, by the way, when we have our object selected, there's a gizmo in the middle of it. We're not going to deal with that today. We want to leave the object alone, but this gizmo will allow you to move, scale, and rotate your object if you need to do that. Again, we're going to leave that alone for now. We're going to concentrate on our lighting. So right here where it says infinite light, we're going to select our infinite light. Now an infinite light is what in other software is called a directional light. So it casts rays in one direction, and it's almost like the sun. It tries to mimic the sun. Even though the sun is really a point light where light emits in every direction, when we're far away from a point light, like we are here on Earth, it actually acts as a directional light. So when we choose infinite light, we get this other little manipulator here, and now we can come over and we can move that around. And you can see this little light up here that moves. It sort of shows you where the light is being emitted from, but we really sort of want to focus on this axis here that will tell you where that light is coming from and where it's going. And it's also giving us information based upon our shadow. So I want you to move this into maybe a high 3/4 light, so we have this nice cast shadow that's coming off of our object. Okay, and then we're just going to leave it alone. Notice in properties we have a bunch of different things, including intensity, which if we bump up, we'll start blowing this object out. We want to sort of leave intensity alone. We also have shadow. If we uncheck this, our shadow will go away. We don't want to do that. We want to keep our shadow. We also have shadow softness. And in this case, we want you to make it to about 10%. And this looks really rough right here. It's very pixelated, but that's because this is just a preview. When we actually do a render, this shadow will look nice. So make sure your shadow softness is at about 11%. Now, because things have gotten so dark over here where the side of our object is in shadow and also on the interior, we want to be able to see a little bit of that. So we're going to add a light to our scene. And to do that, we're going to go into our 3D window down here where you see the light bulb, and we're going to actually add a point light. When we do that, we should see this point light come up. If you want to rotate around and see where it is, you can see that it actually added it in front of the object. I want to move that point light back. And again, I'm rotating around to see exactly where it is. It's not easy in 3D. A lot of times you just have to move that camera. I'm using these arrows to move it back, and I sort of want to move it down. Now we have a ton of light on it, and I'm going to rotate back to where I sort of had that object set up. We have a ton of light on it, and that's because our intensity is too high. I want you to change the intensity of our point light to about 40%. But now we just have a nice sort of bounce light coming off of whatever might be in the scene, but it helps to light it up and make it look a little bit better. We also want to uncheck shadow so we can actually see inside of the object a little bit, and that looks pretty good right there. And now we're going to do a couple of things to finish this thing up. And the first thing is, I think this is extrusion excuse me, is a little bit too far. I want to make our object a little shallower. To do that, if I go up and I select our object, our top layer object, you can see extrusion depth. Right now it's at 662.09 pixels. We're going to move that down to the left, and you can actually see what happens if we go too far. Oh, it goes the other direction. No, we don't want to do that. We just want it to have a little bit of thickness so we can tell it's 3D. And I think we're done with the scene. Now what we want to do to finalize this is we want to render our scene. There are render settings in Photoshop, but we're just going to leave them at their default. And I'm going to click this little button down here next to our light, and you'll see if you hover over it that it says render. So I'm going to click that. You're going to see some blue lines pop up, and this is Photoshop rendering. I'm also seeing the icon for right here where Photoshop is working. So we're going to let it work. It should take less than a minute, I hope. Sometimes this depends on your hardware and your computer, but mine's pretty fast. It doesn't seem very fast. In fact, I think Photoshop's rendering takes a lot longer than it really should, but it is what it is. So we're going to let that finish render. And then in the end, we're going to go back to our original layers tab up here, and we are going to rasterize our 3D object. So what that means, we're going to turn it back into 2D pixels. We're going to flatten our image, and we're going to save it as a JPEG. So hopefully this thing will finish up pretty soon. I don't want to take up too much time in this video, but it looks like it's sort of finishing up. And maybe I'll hit pause. Okay, and now it is done. So let's go back to our layers. And I'm going to rasterize 3D. And when we do that, we should see our object, again, separate from the background. We can actually move this around if we want. But you don't want to do that too much because the perspective sort of changes. And now we're just going to flatten our image and save as a JPEG and submit with the correct file name, please. So that's the basics and beginning of using 3D in Photoshop.